Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. This week, we're going to talk about space. Missions like Polaris Dawn's all-civilian spacewalk and New Shepard's suborbital launches show us that what was once a dream for a select few is now actually expanding to a broader reach. Which begs the question, what are the implications for the Space Force? We normally think about sending humans to space as a form of civil exploration. Should we think about sending Guardians in orbit and beyond as well? And if so, when would that be? Are there conditions that would trigger such an event? And when would we need to get started? So that's what we're here to explore today. The Mitchell Institute's inaugural Space Power Workshop identified that Guardians in space isn't such a crazy idea. In fact, it's probably very important, but it will take time to get there. As America's interests in space grow and humanity ventures further from Earth, Guardians in space will likely play an important role from a security perspective. We're speculating that it's going to be kind of a Back to the Future type moment, where human presence will be interlinked with international standing, economic expansion, setting norms, and guarding security interests. We're probably going to see themes that look like the expansion of the West or colonists traveling to the New World. People didn't just read about it, they went in person, and that drove the need for military engagement. But let's cut to the chase. There's a lot on the Space Force's plate, and they do not have the resources to cover down on even just their near-term priorities. So balancing future investments against current demands is a perennial challenge. However, as with all things space, success often comes down to starting the journey and playing the long game. Partnerships with commercial organizations may help unravel this Gordian knot. So to learn more about the issues and the opportunities of crewed space missions, I'm excited to welcome Max Haot, Chief Executive Officer for VAST, a private U.S. company that is building next-generation space systems. Max, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And also from VAST, in making return to Aerospace Advantage, is John Slick Baum. Slick, it's great to have you back. Welcome.
And Heather, it's great to be here and joining Max on this amazing podcast. Thanks so much for what you do at Mitchell.
Everything that you're doing is absolutely amazing. So we're excited to hear more about that. And we're also pleased to have our senior fellows at MI Space, Charles Galbraith.
Hey, Heather, great to be back. Thanks.
And Jen Boots-Reeve with us too.
Hi, Heather. So happy to be here.
Charles and Boots, let's start with you. Our inaugural space workshop, as I mentioned, touched on the question of having Guardians in space. Can you give us a quick recap of the findings?
Yeah, Lucky. So that wasn't one of our main objectives. We wanted to see what it would take to secure an enduring space power advantage over a long competition, the next 25 years. And to do that, we threw 6 different scenarios at our participants, all designed to test different aspects of what space power advantage means. And we intentionally put some looking further out into the future that would involve humans in space.
Because we're already seeing humans in space, civilians in space right now. So as a participant in that workshop, it was really exciting to see the diversity of players that you had and also those scenarios. They were very realistic.
I hope so. Thank you for that.
as realistic as futurism can be, right?
And so we weren't necessarily trying to predict the future.
Let me just say they're plausible.
There you go, plausible. Yeah, so we weren't trying to predict the future, but we were trying to present an array of likely challenges. And so one of them was, okay, we have a space hotel and it's being threatened. Do we need to evacuate people from that space hotel? How would we do that? And then the last one, the culminating challenge, was rescuing Chinese astronauts from a lunar station. And that helped bring the end to our competition. And so those participants looked at different ways that we might affect those rescues or to render aid. And in some cases, they looked at doing robotic missions. And in others, they said, you know what, humans in space is what we need to do to secure these interests and to move forward. And so it was a really interesting dynamic. And even some of the scenarios that we didn't anticipate having humans involved, there were some participants that said, you know what, we need a human to do that mission because we can't necessarily rely on a machine to do it. And having a human do it brings a whole nother level to the situation and makes the problem set maybe more challenging for our adversaries.
But there were also some participants who didn't think that humans in space was a Guardian job.
Well, that's right. There were some that said, hey, if we're going to have boots on the ground on the moon, That's an Army mission. That's a Marine Corps mission. And there wasn't a great deal of pushback from the participants. And I said, well, wait a minute. It's a space mission. Come on. We want Guardians to be out there. And I get it, right? Right now, there are so many priorities for the Space Force to focus on, and they don't have the resources today to do all of the mission sets that they have today. And so what we're talking about is an expanding mission, going out even further. But hey, if we want to be able to rescue Chinese astronauts from the moon in 2049, maybe there's some things we need to start looking at today to help us prepare for that.
Boots.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly. And I think one of the challenges, though, is there's so much craziness going on with the resourcing of the Space Force, right? Well, the resourcing inside the department writ large, but we're talking about some crazy cuts in a process that's supposed to be really well laid out. And this cycle, we're just really having challenges getting through to an enacted budget for 25, seeing what everything's going to look like in 26. And so I think there's some real challenges because even the Space Force doesn't know what it's going to look like tomorrow or next year with their resources and what it is they're going to have to do with them. So I do believe that they definitely need to keep the momentum going with the projects that are happening right now, that are being planned for right now. But to change the way we do business with, for example, creating a military presence in space, that takes a lot of deliberate planning, a lot of very deliberateness, not just in the planning, but also in the resourcing. And so, yeah, I do think we need to be looking far into the future. And while it is challenging to deal with having to do what has to be done today, we have to keep an eye out for what's coming up. And it's imperative that we get going on it now.
And for our listeners who are curious about what those resources look like, follow us for our rendezvous, which is the first Saturday of every month. We talk about these very issues, especially, for example, the Space Force, because you are the least funded of all of the military services.
Yeah, absolutely. And they talk about the alligator closest to the boat. That's absolutely true. And you got to get past those near-term alligators, but you also have to make sure your boat's headed in the right direction. And that takes some strategic vision, which means looking out into the future and figuring out what do I need to be doing 20, 30 years from now? And what do I need to be doing today to prepare for that?
Very good. So let's get back to the topic at hand, which is humans in space, Guardians in space. Don't we already have Guardians who have gone to space already? And what is the distinction between a Space Force and a NASA astronaut?
Okay, well, let me start with this. Know that right now that NASA's astronaut corps is actually a mix of civilian and military astronauts. Additionally, it's an open system. People can apply to come in through NASA. They can be in the military and apply for NASA as a military member. There's a strong international as well as commercial collaboration, right? We've been embracing this for a very long time. And interestingly, our biggest competitor out there, which is China, they're very, very different. They are 100% military, right? Recently, the People's Liberation Army stood up the astronaut corps, and 100% of their astronauts, their taikonauts, are actually fully military. And so it creates a different construct, if you will, because 100% of their space presence is military presence already, but that's not what we do in the U.S.
Our focus has long been scientific and exploration, right? But if you go all the way back to the Mercury program, we started out Mercury, Gemini, and the first part of Apollo was wholly military. They were military test pilots.
So NASA pulled from military test pilots to become their astronauts.
Yeah.
And so they were assigned to NASA for the civil exploration of space. And that sort of paradigm of we're going to pull military people into NASA and have them become our civil astronauts, that continued for decades. And it really wasn't until the mid to late 90s when people like our General Chilton returned from the astronaut corps and returned to military service. So there is this distinction of, are they doing a military mission or are they doing a civil mission? And yes, there have been a few dedicated military missions on the space shuttle and other efforts. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But absolutely, going back to the very beginning, there has been a huge tie between military professionals, warfighters, that we were talking about earlier, Heather, and their support to NASA and that civil mission. But when it came down to it, when we first landed someone on the moon, there was a huge decision to make, and they wanted to make sure that the person that set foot first on the moon was not an active duty military person. And so, Neil Armstrong, prior military service, yes, but at the time, purely civil.
But I think it gets back to Boots's point when you take a look at China and their civil military fusion, that their Taikanaut Corps is wholly military. And this comes on the back end of them really turning the space domain into a warfighting domain. Very different intents between NASA, which is civil exploration. They may have supported the maintenance and sustainment of military space assets, but very different than, I think, the intent and the feel of what China is.
Yeah, in the United States, we've tried to bifurcate our space activities. We certainly have military space activities, but we've tried to preserve space as a peaceful domain for all mankind. China's view is it is part of our national prestige, it is part of our national power, and they continue to consolidate all of their space activities underneath their PLA.
So I mentioned this in the opener when I was talking about exploring and traveling to the new world. Don't these themes match what we saw in those past areas of terrestrial exploration? Because both civilians and military personnel explored and settled those regions. So it took both to be able to make that happen successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always been a long cooperation between military and civil when it comes to exploration. You can think about Lewis and Clark journeying across the United States. Well, it wasn't the United States, North America at the time, and that exploration. And that has proven a good framework for us to consider for other areas where the military may take a lead effort, such as the internet. The DARPA and the establishment of the internet led to what we have today. GPS, a military program that is now ubiquitous with every user on the planet, used by civil and commercial private citizens. So there's this long-standing tradition of military and civil and civilian cooperation when it comes to venturing out into new areas.
But Boots, I'd like your perspective on this, because putting humans in space creates a totally different dynamic, right? It's more than just the internet or GPS. The need to be able to provide security in that environment really requires having that military stability.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think if we look back to those initial forays into the deep unknown, putting military members up there first, especially those that are highly technical, right? I mean, the Mercury 7 were all military members because this was a highly, highly technical and very unknown enterprise that we were starting to enter on. And so very highly trained military members we've trained them to be able to have the capacity to react to wildly unexpected situations that do have a level of technology and technological expertise that's required. And so I think it's a smart move. Then what comes later, of course, when we diversify who's actually in the environment, for example, well, then there are going to be issues that need to be managed, right? What happens when we have a multipolar world up there in space and we have to deal with state level issues? For example, I think there is a need for this, and there will be a need for this, as we've seen throughout history. And so it's time to get after it.
That's a perfect segue. Thank you, Boots. So, Max and Slick, I'd like to bring VAST into this conversation because NASA has crewed missions and conducts operations on the International Space Station. So what drove you to establish VAST and pursue a commercial space habitat?
So, thank you. And as you mentioned, we are a commercial space station company. So what does that mean, right? All historical space station program in the past or even current, the Chinese Tiangong Space Station or the ISS, are really government-owned asset and government-owned space station. No one has ever built a privately or commercially built space station to date. And so why is that important? If you look at the ISS, this is the most expensive object ever created by human, by some account over as much as 150 billion to create. And if today you use fixed firm price contract, you use a modern method to build spacecraft that includes vertical integration and speed while not compromising safety, you could create a space station for hundreds of millions of dollars for a much, much lower cost and scale it up from there. And that's obviously really useful, obviously, for private industry in space manufacturing or pharmaceutical, sponsorship, media mission, even private individuals that are interested to do important work in space. But it's also a great future for governments, including obviously the Space Force and the DoD and military, where we can now do a lot more in space with people for a portion 10 times or even 100 times lower cost than we could before. So VAST is created in 2021, and since 2023, we have set our roadmap to build and operate the world's first commercial space station called Haven 1. You can see a render behind me in this control room. And we are due to launch it in May 2026, so it's coming up very quickly. We've grown to a team of over 900 people. We are fully funded for this launch, which will be on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket without the crew at first. And then a few weeks later, as early as the end of June 2026, we will have a crew of 4 come and dock to Haven 1 for 2 weeks aboard a SpaceX Dragon. So this will be the first time anyone anywhere in the world has created a commercial space station. And there are some key advantages. The price and how we are able to provide the service is one of them. The other one is that we are free to do civil or DoD or military activities in that station, something that has not been possible really on the ISS, which is an international collaboration and has rules and restrictions.
I see a lot of advantage to that, especially since we've already been talking about having human guardians in space as well. And also, isn't the International Space Station due to retire and be deorbited?
Yeah, the key opportunities for anyone building a commercial space station, or one of the key opportunities is the retirement of the ISS. And there are key reasons for that, right? First, it's a partnership with Russia, which is right now geopolitically not the kind of partnership we need. Secondly, it's too expensive to the American taxpayer. And thirdly, it is aging, and there are some safety concern and leak and issue. And so following on the footsteps of the first real fixed firm price crewed commercial program that NASA did, which is the conversion of the space shuttle to the Starliner of Boeing that's not yet ready and the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft. Mm-hmm. This was a huge success in saving taxpayer money and going from a wholly owned fleet of spacecraft by the United States at a great expense to a private company, in this case SpaceX, that is providing a service to the government, a price per seat to the ISS at a much reduced price. And so you mentioned the ISS, the government want to do exactly the same thing with the ISS. It's time to retire it. And let's not just build another one, or let's not obviously cede low Earth orbit to China, which is there now every day, which wasn't the case obviously when the ISS was launched. And let's replace it with a commercial one where the government and NASA and the Space Force, we hope, will be a key anchor customer, along with international governments, their military and their space agencies, and some private and industry. But it's a space station that the government is an anchor customer, but is not the only customer. And as a result, it's much lower cost. And what that really means is that we can do as a nation a lot more than we used to with the same resource or less resource if our budget dictates.
So does China currently have an enduring or consistent human presence in low Earth orbit?
Yeah, I mean, maybe Slick, you want to cover that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate everything that Max has said so far. And really just to reiterate from my air and space power background, if we look at history, Heather, and I know that you're an aviation buff as well, and you think back to the 19-teens and early 1920s, essentially 100 years ago, when the government owned all the airplanes and all the pilots were employees of what was the CAA, now the FAA, we couldn't even figure out how to deliver mail as a nation. And then we had entrepreneurs that came in and created UPS and FedEx. And now, 100 years later, we're able to overnight packages from the US to Europe or Asia. And that is the power of what the commercial industry can now finally bring to space. And I have a little bit of experience in a previous entrepreneurial endeavor with Draken International, where only nations were allowed to own fighter jets. And we amassed the largest privately owned fleet of fighter jets in the world, and we were able to provide a turnkey service, saving the taxpayer $1.2 billion a year by taking the red air burden off of our men and women in uniform and being able to provide training. So I think so much of that, as we look at national defense, and especially with our budding Space Force, that can you just imagine, this is like being back in 1947, hanging out with all of the first generals that went from the Army into creating the Air Force and being able to develop tactics, techniques, and procedures in the way that you're going to utilize this new domain of air. And one of the things that I've been saying and discussing with some of our military leaders is we have the Army is our boots on the ground, as you mentioned before. With the Navy, we have sailors on ships. Our Air Force airmen, as we know, are in the air domain, but we don't have our service members in the Space Force, our guardians, in their warfighting domain. And it's not to say that we initially need to just jump in there and do offensive war type of activities, but we do need to answer the fact that, yes, the I think many people don't know that the Chinese have a space station that's essentially the same altitude, counter orbit with the International Space Station. And it's owned by the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. And all of their members that are on, all their tagonauts, they're all military members. So we already have a military entity that's in space. And this is like going back 1,000 years and saying, hey, we understand one of our adversaries is using boats as a military vessel, and we're deciding, we don't really want to start investing in a navy, right? I mean, it's just crazy. I think we need to start looking at what the adversary is doing and making sure that we answer back to have the ability to truly answer what our adversaries are doing and make sure that we have true space superiority, because eventually, I hope in 100 years from now, and unfortunately I won't be around to see it, but if we have people that are, or companies, US companies that are mining on the moon, and somebody unfortunately has a compound fracture because they fall or a piece of equipment falls on them and we need to do personal recovery, we can utilize, based on the roots of what the Space Force comes from, the Air Force, our amazing pararescue men. If we think about things like personal recovery, I want to be able to have Guardians go and provide medical care for an American asset on the moon. And they shouldn't be figuring out how to do that for the very first time. They need to have the reps to where they go to a commercial space station where it's far cheaper for them to start operating in their domain. They can go there and have an incredible piece of equipment to start developing their own TTPs and thinking about what they can do in 100 years from now. So I think we have an incredible opportunity by leveraging Haven 1 on the short term, where we literally could have Guardians go to a space station in 11 to 12 months from now. So 1 year from now, we could have 4 Guardians operating in their domain, not doing offensive operations, but figuring out how they're going to use their domain. So I think it's just such an exciting time from a space power perspective.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From,
do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To,
he has your eyes.
He's perfect.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So, Max and Slick, I think it's incredible that you're doing this, especially from a commercial standpoint, because you're not responding to very specific requirements, design requirements by the government. You're actually able to leverage the innovation of civil industry. And so creating and fielding a space station has got to be such a huge project. What were some of the major challenges you were faced?
Well, the first thing is that we do want some of the key requirements from the government, especially the heritage and technology and safety. And so as a commercial entity, we get to learn from that to base our design on all of that historical knowledge and best practice that NASA has created and take the best out of it, right? Maybe some of it we don't need, that would create a lot of overhead and increase cost, and some we should take, which increase safety. So back to your question, the key is first you need obviously the right funding and the right team, but the number one effort is to build our incredible engineering team. And most of VAST is engineering and manufacturing. And we've been lucky that SpaceX has really created an engineering culture and a lot of engineering talent that were trained originally on the Dragon, the Cargo Dragon spacecraft and the Crew Dragon spacecraft, which was developed in the 2010s. And a lot of these people, might have spent 5 years, 10 years at SpaceX and left to do something else. And when the call came to join again a fully funded, well-led and logical crewed space program, which is our Haven 1 program, the world's first commercial space station, it's really, if you combine it with great culture and being in the right place, which is in California, in Long Beach, we were able to attract an incredible amount of experienced talent, also new talent, that formed together at VAST and has been for the last 2 years help building and designing Haven 1. We obviously also have our safety and mission assurance team. We have our mission operations team, which is a range of experience between NASA and SpaceX and other places, as well as our manufacturing team, which is key. And we've built facilities. So if you look at VAST in the last 2 years, we launched the Haven 1 program in May 2023. In February of that year, we had 40 people, and we had a tiny office in El Segundo. Fast forward 2 years, where we've been building, we are now more than 900 people. We have all the facilities we need to build, integrate, design, obviously, and operate space stations. And we're nearly fully staffed for what we expect we will have for the mission next year. So people and talent is the key. And the other part is the right strategy that for us, starting with a simple single module space station that we can fund and we can build and launch in sort of our 0 to 1, right? To get to prove to all of our customers, to the US government, that we are an actual operating commercial safe space station company. All of that together is what will create this huge breakthrough that we will see next year.
So, Max, when I was talking about requirements, clearly you're dealing with safety standards and integration, not necessarily designing to a predetermined design. I mean, you're really leveraging the innovation and creativity of your engineers. Was there anything that you had to invent to achieve your vision?
I think the first step, right, if you look at our first space station, is really keeping it simple. So, for example, you have life support system that can be very complicated, like we have on ISS, which are fully recycling all of the consumable, and they are very efficient, but they took many, many years to build. Or you have a simpler life support system, which were used on the space shuttle or the Apollo program, where you bring your consumable, or even on Dragon. So we chose for Haven 1, our approach is minimum viable product. Requirement number 1, safety. Requirement number 2, that it happens soon within our funding. And so we've made these choices that are, we're not going for the most advanced of everything. We're being quite conservative. It's still an incredible space station, incredibly designed, that has 6 times more volume than on a Dragon spacecraft. We've also pushed the boundaries in some area. For example, we are the first space station company where SpaceX has agreed to provide Starlink laser connectivity, which will provide gigabit connectivity to our payload and the crew, something that's never been done on a space station over Wi-Fi or Ethernet. But the biggest breakthrough, right, is to create the team, the process, the facilities, so that we can build the space station faster and lower cost. So that's really the focus, not the innovation for the sake of it. Once we get there, we will have many innovations, and I'm sure in the next 10 years, we'll probably be the best at doing life support system in the world, and we will probably have new breakthroughs and maybe even patents related to it. But right now, it's more focused on lower cost, making it happen, and safety and speed, as opposed to innovation for the sake of it.
Yeah, Max, I'd like to pull on that thread a little bit that you mentioned about the minimum viable product, because we talked about the International Space Station being the most expensive thing that humanity's ever built, but it was designed in the 80s, basically, built in the 90s, and to last decades. And it sounds like with Haven 1 in particular, you're not designing it to last decades. You're designing it to last a couple of missions maybe, and that's it, because production costs can come down so much more significantly now than they could in the past, perhaps. And that's a different mindset.
Yeah, the sweet spot, not for our first space station, but our second space station will be Haven 2, which is the one designed to succeed the ISS, which will have more module and will also be designed to be at least 10 years of life per module. Economically, it's a great spot to be at. Maybe not decades, but something like 10 years. For Haven 1, to keep it simple, we decided that we would have a lifetime of 3 years, and that helps us reduce the complexity of the power system as well as the propulsion system. And during that time, we will have 4 crewed missions of 2 weeks each during the 3 years. That's one way to keep it simple, but for our next space station, we definitely want to push that a bit further to something like 10 years to use the asset as long as we can. But the first one, it's important to be conservative. And if you look at parallels like the early Soviet space station program, for example, you can see similar parallel, right? They didn't start with Mir, they didn't start with their contribution to the ISS. They started with space station like Salyut, which were single module space station to start to prove the concept. And we basically have to do that for obviously the United States has built the ISS, but for the commercial world, it's never been done. No one has ever built a commercial space station. So let's start simple and then iterate from that platform that we will have earned after our first mission.
This iterative approach is really interesting, especially because of how that allows you to bring down costs, decrease complexity, and actually accelerate your learning as you move that into Haven 2. But this is not going to be 5-star accommodations. It's going to be very Spartan and utilitarian. At least that's what I expect. So how would you describe Haven?
We don't believe you have to choose one or the other. It's obviously, going to a space station or going to space is an expedition, an adventure. It obviously has risk. So it's definitely nothing like going to a luxury hotel. And we at Vast, we're not interested in space tourism, or we're not interested in building a luxury hotel. There will be a time, in a few decades that might be the case. Today, even though the cost, we're talking about the limited resource of the Space Force, the cost, one of the key opportunities, in addition to the Space Force having been created relatively recently, is that the time is right because the cost is much lower than it would have been before. But it's still a pretty expensive investment. So even if private individuals are going to space, our view is that they should be doing important work, for the benefit of Earth or the benefit of space exploration. So the cost is still quite a piece there that we don't see tourism being a priority. Having said that, we also believe that you can design Haven 1, and if you go online and check our design, we think that they're quite spectacular. And for no real incremental costs, you can apply high design to it and to increase the chance that you reach your mission objective. And it's pretty simple. If you go home and you sleep better, you communicate better, you eat better, you feel better, the next day you're going to work better. You're going to be more productive. And so the same thing is in a space station. If you design it well, if the sleeping accommodation are as comfortable as they can be, if the food is as good as it can be, if the noise level are as good as they can be, the air feels great. This is only going to mean that when our guardians or when our astronauts are performing during their day, all of the work they have to do, which is the reason why they went there, they might be, twice more productive or 30% more productive because of the environment we created. So clearly it is a space experience, an expedition, an adventure, but we are making it as comfortable as we can even with our first space station.
So Slick, you took a mock-up of Haven 1 to the Space Symposium. Boots and Charles, you also saw this. So how would you describe this? In my mind now, I'm envisioning like gorgeous Swedish architecture, simple, utilitarian, but elegant.
It was
Heather,
a little.
I wanted to jump in here really quickly because I have to quote our chief of design and marketing, Hillary Coe. And, I'm of the generation that really resonates when she said, and we see it on TV, on the news, and we see our NASA astronauts and multinational astronauts floating around the International Space Station. I mean, there's wires and connectors and all this stuff. And, what Hillary said, she's like, it's like looking inside of a VCR. It just looks like there's stuff poking at you all over the place. And, that's where completely adding to what Max said, you really can increase productivity and increase the ability to do more science and research when you sleep well and you've got a really collaborative environment. So I know what I think of the space station, but I definitely want to hear what Charles and Boots think about it when we got to give them a tour during Symposium.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to walk through your mock-up at Space Symposium. And it was really nice. It was a little IKEA-ish, if I can use that word.
In the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Yeah,
I'm a fan. It was very well designed, and you've got former astronauts helping you with the design. So you're not making this up from nothing. You're starting from a baseline level of understanding of what works and what doesn't work and what you would need in that environment.
And what they would want.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Heather, you brought up 5-star accommodations. My experience in travel is some of that is often based off of the view you have, not necessarily the size of your room.
The killer view. You cannot.
You're going to get a good view.
Yes.
Now, the window isn't that huge on Haven 1, but there is one. And I think that's going to carry a lot of
So we're looking at Haven
star
2.
Value.
Yeah, I like that. Star value. 1 million star review,
there you
right?
Go.
So Haven 2, looking at potentially a decade-long lifespan. Slick and Max, what's the long-term vision for VAST? I mean, is low Earth orbit just a starting point? What do you see this growing into?
Yeah, we see ourselves as the crewed space system company, right? We want to be the best company in the universe or the world to build any kind of crewed space system. So when other companies might have a specialty in building satellites or rocket, our specialty is when it involves a crew. So starting point, low Earth orbit, of course, single module space station. And then we will have the honor and privilege to replace and succeed the International Space Station, and that will be a larger multi-module space station that can grow commercially and obviously with the help of the government to be more capable than the ISS and more capable than the Chinese space station Tiangong. Beyond that, we hope we will have the opportunity to build dedicated space station for nations, dedicated space station for the DoD, including the Space Force, because we can do them at much lower cost and obviously customize them to the right mission sets that are needed. We also have aspiration to build habitats, which are very similar to space stations, but that are on the moon or on Mars or other place, and even space stations in different orbit eventually, right, where cislunar or other planetary orbit. So anytime anything that touches a crew and that is a pressure vessel, a space system, BAS wants to be involved. We also have a very long-term vision that there is a need, if we will be a spacefaring civilization, which we will be, and we are dedicated to contribute to that we see a world where there are millions of people living off Earth, maybe one day more than are even on Earth, right? Not because we left, because we grew out there. And they will be on Mars and other planets, but we also believe that they will be in space stations. And for that to be a reality, we need to innovate and make science fiction a reality of artificial gravity, right, through spinning. And it's a basic physics principle. If you spin a space station, you can create, 1g of gravity on either end and microgravity in the center of the spinning. But it's really important to achieve that as a human race so that people can stay in space for longer than a year. Today, if you send an astronaut that's been trained and is extremely fit, and you require them to exercise 2 hours every day, as they do on the space station, if they come back after 6 months to a year or even over a year, it will take as much as a year to recover from bone loss, muscle loss. It's a really, really difficult experience for professionals. And so artificial gravity will help allow people to, maybe live lifetime in space or spend years or decades. So that's our North Star or long-term contribution that we hope to achieve. But we'll never get there unless we become a profitable company building low Earth orbit space station this decade. And so that's what we are focused on now.
I wanted to add, Heather, some specificity with my background and opening the DoD with BAS, and what we're doing is, first and foremost, being an American-made space station is something that hasn't been done for decades and decades. So the ability for our engineers and manufacturers to do what they're doing every day in Long Beach, it's just something, that we're super proud of. And we know that that's something that resonates with our Guardians as well. And I think we just need to continue to expand it as this new force thinks about their domain. It is their domain. They're the Space Force. They should own it. They should operate it. And we just want to enable them to do things and enable America primarily to really think about really going to the high ground. So for the last, since, in 1947, we've been engaged in air and having that ultimate high ground. And yes, we've done some things in space, but really starting to graduate our thinking and looking at the E-4, the quote unquote doomsday airplane. Why does that have to be the C2 ISR platform of choice? As we grow in 2025 and beyond, we should be thinking about permanent bases and stations or places that when America decides to quote unquote saber rattle, instead of sending B-52s to Guam or Diego Garcia, if we start manning our space stations, that could be part of a Golden Dome or other things. I think it's just a real opportunity for us to be incredibly creative with the Guardians and see how we can enable them. So we ultimately want to make sure that we are no kidding superior in space. And unfortunately, I hate to say that, the Chinese are beating us there with their space station and their Guardians or, their Tagonauts that are on their space station. So we got a little bit of catching up to do, but I know America is innovative enough, and what BAS can bring to the table is really going to be game changing.
Yes, just a quick editorial comment from a not air power history advocate here, but I hang around a bunch. So, their air power development occurred prior to the establishment of the Air Force.
Yes.
Right? There was a lot of great stuff happening in World War I and interwar years towards the advancement. In the same way that before the Space Force existed, we were looking at potential opportunities for military actions in space. And we talked about the relationship between former military pilots and their support to NASA. But there were also several military programs that were initiated. X-15, the Dinosaur program, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, right?
Hitting all my sweet spots.
Yeah. There was even dedicated space shuttle missions that were focused on military missions with the entire crew being military. One in particular I wanted to highlight for folks was STS-51C. And what's significant about this is they actually had a program called Military Man in Space. And it was looking at how could we use a military member in orbit to support military operations. Well, what was interesting is at the time they were focused on, and another quick editorial, this was an Army program, guys. They were looking at basically having an Army scout from space looking at how to provide observations of combat operations. And so looking through a telescope back at the Earth, and relaying communications of troop movements.
GMTI.
They determined that really having a human in space to do that mission was not necessary because we could get that same level of support from our robotic missions. And today, the Space Force is able to do its missions without having Guardians in space. However, as we think about the future of space and stop thinking about space looking back only at the Earth, but looking at space into space and further from the Earth's orbit, there's a whole set of missions out there that we need to consider. Slick, you talked about pararescue potentially for injured astronauts. There may be other activities exactly like that that we need to be thinking about. But again, not back at the Earth, but towards space and out into space.
And I think that Max had mentioned this earlier, like the other orbits, whether or not that's cislunar or these become leaping pads for being able to reach the moon or Mars or further. I mean, I think you're right. As we begin to change our perspective of where we're looking on space, that changes what we might think of the utility of space.
Yeah, absolutely.
One way to think about it is to think a little bit more long term, right? If you think over the next few decades, I think it's 100% sure that a uniform Guardian will have gone to space. That would just be ridiculous as we advance towards a spacefaring civilization. It will just happen. And so, why wait, right? Why not be the leadership today, be the first one to create this event of having a uniform Guardian go to space and get started? It'll certainly inspire many recruits and many people in the Corps, but also bring a lot of expertise back to input how maybe space systems and space station for the Space Force should be designed in the future. And then the other two key triggers, or the three, right? One is the Space Force, I guess the 5th anniversary, right, this year or thereabout. So that's pretty new. Secondly, we are talking about a commercial space station where there is zero restrictions in terms of what military activity can occur. And that's not the case with the ISS, right? You cannot send a Guardian uniform to the ISS due to the charter and the civil nature of it. And third, as we mentioned a few times, budget and restrictions of the Space Force. But guess what? We're going to the commercial era where sending somebody to Haven 1 for a 2-week mission is an unprecedented low cost. And obviously, if it fits into a broader strategy that is important to the Space Force, it's never been a better time in terms of the cost and the commitment. You can literally try it, just one crew member, one mission, and then go from there. So we're excited to enable it. And I think it's just a question of which leadership. Is it today's leadership, or is the one in 10 years or in 20 years? But somebody is going to send one of many Guardians to space. It's just a question of time.
Yeah. And,
and if I could chime in,
go ahead, Jen.
What's happening right now is China's already doing this. China is already doing this. And so they're teeing themselves up for those operations that you talked about, Charles, looking away from the Earth. They are teeing themselves up with Tiangong already with a full military crew and being ready for cislunar, being ready for perhaps a lunar presence, a full military lunar presence. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think it's time for us to be looking at that as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Jen. And we've, in studying Chinese documents and the language that they're putting out, it is clear that they intend to dominate space. That is part of their overall strategy, to supplant the United States' leadership position. And they have made no secrets about the fact that they want to control the cislunar space as well. And so you're exactly right. And I just want to circle back real quick on the fact that, we talk about warfare and the fog and friction of warfare, how it makes the simple things hard. Well, those simple things are really hard in space, too.
Even before they're contested. Even before there's fog and friction.
And so we need to give our Guardians an opportunity to prepare for those things. I was just thinking a very simple, crude example, and I don't think anybody would ever do this, but, you hit a hammer onto a nail on Earth, no problem, right? You do that in space, you might be bouncing back a little further than you would otherwise. So the tools that you have to use, the way that you employ them,
the way that you have to move, right?
Exactly. I mean, everything's going to be different.
And this is why I think it's absurd to consider anybody other than a Guardian going to space. Like, I'm not going to take an 18-year-old infantry kid and send him off to space, because just moving around how we are as humans and how we behave in space is very, very different. It takes years to train an astronaut to be able to successfully go do extravehicular activities in space. So we have to make sure that there are professionals that are warfighters that are actually trained to do that.
Absolutely.
And it's also interesting, Charles, I really liked how you framed the need to look not just down at the terrestrial Earth and activities from space, but to look outwards as well. Because as we look at China's aspirations, not just to dominate low Earth orbit, geo orbit, cislunar, but as well as their desire to exploit the resourcing on the moon and at Mars. Yeah. We need to look at this as a real security space race. I mean, this is a national issue, and we can't either cede that to the PLA, to China, and we certainly don't also want to just allow that to go commercial, right? Because the need for security will always be there. We'd rather have our military doing that, not some kind of militia, and certainly not the CCP.
Yeah, and a cooperation, right, is
yes.
What's absolutely key here. Because, as Max and Slick have talked about, there's great benefit in having commercial ventures move out because of the cost, because of the risks that they're able to take, because of what they're able to do. But having a military in lockstep with them, shoulder to shoulder, I think that's going to be critical. And providing that security to enable those commercial ventures to go off and do the things that they need to do.
To succeed, right?
Absolutely. And, we talk a lot about space superiority here. And that's important. It's absolutely critical, and that's going to be essential for any future fight here on Earth. Space superiority is going to absolutely be critical. But here at the Space Power Advantage Center of Excellence, we also talk about space power advantage, and that's more than just the military aspects. It's about the global recognition that you are the leader in this area, and other countries want to partner with you. And there are opportunities to lead the rest of the world in this area, not necessarily to just fight and win, although we could do that if we needed to, but just to lead and push the envelope further forward than anybody else.
So, Max and Slick, I'd like to get your perspective on this, because we really cannot cede our advantage in space. And, as Charles mentioned, this is a partnership between NASA, the Space Force, and commercial ventures. What do you see your role in this?
Well, our role is to enable successfully and safely the transition to commercial. I think it's unsustainable the way we've had continuous human presence in low Earth orbit, which is very important strategically, is unsustainable. The costs are too high for today's budget, and it doesn't have to be this high. So our role is to enable this vision and this requirement that the government have, and be the provider that the government can depend on to obviously bring military crew or civil crew to space, perform important mission and activity safely and at the lowest cost physically possible.
Yeah, and I wanted to add as well, Max, you mentioned it earlier, but this is about leadership. And America has been the leaders in space, but we also don't go at it alone. As we know, we always build incredible coalitions, and we have our partners. And from an international perspective, we have really made incredible friends by having this notion of this commercialized space station and opportunity, where we've signed multiple MOUs and one to share that's been public with the Czech Republic. We take it for granted. We've had multiple astronauts go to space multiple times, but there are countries that dream of sending an extremely talented individual to space, but they might not have the budget to afford a whole mission. But we can, as VAST, build together, coalitions. If it's militaries, where we could have our other partners and allies that we would work with in space. I know that we've interviewed many folks, they're space leaders here on the Aerospace Advantage, from the UK to the French and the Germans. And we know that they have aspirations to continue protecting their assets in space. And we want to do that as a coalition together. So could I see a Space Force mission where we have French and Czech and Italian astronauts going together and training together? Absolutely. And I think those are the types of things that we really need to endeavor. And I think VAST, with the partnerships that we're succeeding with on the commercial side, will also hopefully make a lot of great connections on our military leadership around the world, and see how we can collaborate together, and we can really be a bridge and an enabler. So that's something that I'm truly excited about. And to echo Max's words one last time, this is about leadership, and it's about folks stepping up and taking portions of their budget and really leaning in early so that they can be those leaders in space.
Yeah, Slick, the Space Force and the U.S. Space Command last year released a strategy for how to leverage commercial capabilities. Manned or crewed spaceflight was not in either of those, but the sentiments that you're talking about here are exactly in line with those two documents. And how can the military leverage what commercial is doing to accelerate their own efforts and then move forward in a great collaborative and partnership way? Absolutely. This is going to be a building effort, and it's going to take years and years and years to get to where we think we need to be. And even then, there's going to be something next on the horizon. But it's got to start somewhere. And if we don't start taking steps now, we're never going to be running in the future.
So we start May 26, right? That's when we're going to have Haven 1 launched and on orbit. And then shortly followed after that by Haven 2. But folks, I'd like to really kind of give us some milestones of where we should be in 5 and 10 years. We've talked about the really long-term vision. We know what the near-term milestones are, but what will it take? Where should we be and what will it take in 5 and 10 years? What does that success look like? What's at stake if we don't meet those goals? And what will it take to meet them? Max, let's start with you.
Yeah, in 5 years, we need to have replaced the International Space Station and be well on the way to continue to build that out for important capabilities beyond what the ISS does today and what China and Tiangong are doing. That's the minimum, right? And sustain permanent human presence, American human presence in space and bring all of our partners that we have today already on the ISS, but also emerging nations that were not part of the ISS and are part of the Western world that want to be involved with the successor to the ISS. So that's the basics. And then beyond that, I hope personally that we will be on Mars and that VAST will have a part of that, and that we will also be on the moon to stay. And these will be also very important objective that I hope the government and the industry as a whole will achieve for America and its partners.
Yeah, and one thing that I wanted to add to from beyond that 5-year point with the ISS, again, keeping my blue hat on here, thinking about what would it be, the U.S. Space Station Saltzman or something like that, to where we have Guardians with a permanent presence in space. I mean, and I truly mean that from folks that are leaders, and they're going to put these things in motion today so that we have the ability to have sustainability in space, so we can move C2ISR and other things to the highest high ground and have multiple stations. I think we need to shift from this paradigm of just having an international space station to where we have multiple stations doing multiple things. And one thing, because we're focused about space power, but, we are truly trying to innovate in many areas, whether it's cancer research, because just a quick discussion where, human skin cells and things like that grow 3.5 times faster in space. So just looking at Haven 1, where we're focused on the science and research, we can do a decade's worth of cancer research in 3.5 years while we're on orbit. So those are the things that we're trying to move out on. And so we're trying to take that energy into the DoD and the Space Force to really accelerate where I feel that we're behind compared to the Chinese.
Boots?
So I for sure think, if nothing else, we should have had a handful of Guardians along for the ride within 5 years, right? A TDY, if you will, as we call them in the military.
I like
go
it.
for the 2 weeks just to experience it, much like any space tourists who will get the chance to experience. And then from there, we need to continue, as everyone has already said, planning on what this looks like in the future for operations and other things. I wanted to tell a tiny little story about being a young, bright-eyed space operator, almost 30 years ago, and coming into the Air Force at the time because I wanted to be an astronaut. But then, of course, I got into space operations, which is all unmanned. And from the military perspective, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember asking the question, come on, why do we even need astronauts? I mean, I was very, very sure of myself, undeservedly so at that point. And the answer was quite nuanced. And it was something that I could have never imagined in sort of my arrogance of youth phase. And it's that, listen, the astronauts who go to space, we can all see that. We can all picture that. We see the humans going into space. We want to be those humans. We want our kids to be those humans. We want to know the humans that are actually going into space. And what ends up happening is that lends humanity to the entire endeavor, manned and unmanned, right? So then the entire enterprise is benefited by having those, I'm going to say it first, token humans in space. But what's happening now is we're also moving beyond that. We still need that. We need our humans in space to see and encourage the rest of the enterprise and get that support for the entire enterprise. But then on top of that, We're moving into a new world, and the Chinese have already put us there. And we have to react to that status. We need to take that leadership. The Space Force needs to move out on this and come up with a coherent plan ahead and how we're actually going to integrate into operations by having Guardians in space.
Yeah, Jen, I can't agree with you more on the inspirational aspect of having, somebody that's gone and done something and you go, boy, I would really like to do that. That's exciting. That excites me. So there's that inspirational aspect to this. But there's also very good practical reasons for why we need to be doing these things as well, as we talked about.
As a kid, I looked at the astronauts in the Apollo program.
Yep.
Every time I see a Saturn V launch, and obviously not in real life, it still gets me all teary-eyed and just inspired, right? Like my spirit grows and I want to do that with us. But there's also, as you mentioned, the operational, the pragmatic, and then the strategic level.
Jen, I 100% agree with the inspirational aspect. We see someone do that. We want to do it. And it inspires the next generation. It helps grow the future Space Force. There's also the practical aspect here. What are the things that we need to do? Slick mentioned the scientific research, helping cancer research. There are other things that we'll need to develop skills that we currently don't have or don't even know that we need to have, that will have to be developed. And then there's the essential element. That is that our interests in space are going to grow and they need to be protected because there will be threats, as we've seen anywhere that there's scarce resources. There's going to be a competition for those resources. We need to be able to protect those. So I think there's three elements: inspirational, practical, and essential. Where we need to go in the next 5 to 10 years, I think they've done a great job of summarizing that. I like the idea of having multiple stations to perform multiple missions, not just in Earth orbit, but also in cislunar space and lunar orbit, and then even going out to Mars. So I think there's a lot of, it is the future. It's a boundless potential out there.
It's a strategic necessity. And what I love about what VASTA is doing is that they are harnessing civil and commercial innovation and expertise to be able to deliver on a strategic national imperative. Thank you all for a great discussion. Max, Slick, Charles, and Boots, it's been a fascinating conversation and an interesting look into the near future. A little bit of a look back, but also to the far future. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, Heather.
Thanks, Heather.
This was so fun. Thanks again.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time. Okay, Charles, show us your socks. All right, he's on theme. He's on theme. I see a name. Oh, very much on theme.
Yeah.
That's. We're gonna have an Amy coming up here, and I predict it's gonna soon be boots and socks. I wish you all could see. I wish you all could see. They're great. They're great. All right, y'all. Thank you so much. Slick, have a great time in Paris, and let's go flying soon.